It is almost always one of the highlights of any federal campaign. Sometimes it even changes the outcome of the race. Last night, the English language leaders debate marked a few firsts, from including new parties to a multi-moderator format. Did the debate do what the voters needed to help them decide? Let's ask. Mark Keeley, former advisor to Prime Minister John Turner, now principal with the strategy implementation firm Keeley & Associates, Inc. Amanda Galbraith, communications staffer in Stephen Harper's government, now a principal at the strategy and communications firm Navigator. From the nation's capital via Skype, Anne McGrath, former chief of staff for Jack Layton, now an associate with the public affairs team at Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Abhijit Mane, deputy leader for the Green Party of Ontario. Jared Brown, lawyer and a strategist for the People's Party of Canada. And Aaron Kelly, president and CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc., and it's great to have. Apparently somebody decided we needed as many people around this table and in Ottawa as they had on the stage of the debate last night. Let's take a look at some of the highlights first, because we got to do that. We'll do some of the highlights from the debate, and then we'll come back and we'll find out what 300,000 people that you surveyed last night had to say about it. Sheldon, if you would, please.
He can't even remember how many times he put blackface on, because the fact of the matter is he's always wearing a mask. He puts on a reconciliation mask and then fires the Attorney General, the first one of Indigenous background.
We love this country, and it's not because I want to have a discussion about immigration that I'm a radical.
Only 6%. Your role on this stage tonight seems to be to say publicly what Mr. Scheer thinks privately.
You are not clear, Andrew, that we will never allow a single inch of retreat from the hard-earned rights of women in this country, not 1 inch.
What we have here is Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Scheer arguing about who's worse for Canada. Really, we got to start arguing. We got to start presenting who's going to be best for Canada. You do not need to choose between Mr. Delay and Mr. Deny.
Okay, some of the highlights from last night. Actually, I don't think they had the best line of the night in there, which was, if you're so interested in the Ontario political situation, there's a Liberal leadership that's vacant right now. That was Andrew Scheer's line against Justin Trudeau, which was pretty good. Okay, you've done the surveying. Unlike the other pollsters, you're not doing 1,000 people, you're doing 300,000 people. You've got the artificial intelligence algorithms being brought to bear. Who won?
And we watched them all night.
And you watched it as it went.
Last night and this morning. And Mr. Singh was the clear winner. He was the clear winner last night. When he presented, he got 15 times the lift that he had before the debate, and he continued to be the winner after the debate. He was the only leader of the 6 who did not see a decline in the number of people talking about him.
Just take us through this chart, and in doing so, let me set it up by saying, for those listening on podcast who can't say it, we've got the bars. It's a bar graph, basically, of all the parties. Justin Trudeau is fairly low, Andrew Scheer just a little bit lower. The Bloc leader is actually, quite high. Elizabeth May quite high. Maxime Bernier, about half of what Jagmeet Singh did. But Mr. Singh clearly is, at the top of the list.
He's clearing away the leader. He had a lot of good moments, and he even had the other leaders praising him, which was a high point for him, where they all said, we really appreciate what you've done for visible minorities in Canada, and you're an example. And people were seeing that even the other leaders like Jagmeet Singh. So there was a lot of, not only did a lot of people talk about him, it was very positive. People were impressed. They were impressed by, especially his interchange with Maxime Bernier, where he said, your ideas don't deserve a platform in Canada, something to that effect. That really resonated with people, even more than his denying delay, which was number 2 of his interchanges.
What were the topics that voters were most interested in as you surveyed the opinions last night?
It was really interesting. What people talked about during the debate was different from what they talked about after the debate. So this was really interesting. So going into the debate, it was, Indigenous issues was the number 1 thing during the debate that people talked about. People also talked about taxes. There was a lot of talk about Mr. Scheer, the interchange between Trudeau and Scheer on the 50K, which was, of course, the cutting taxes across the board. So a lot of people talking about that. Those were the main things, affordability, taxes, during the debate. After the debate.
Let's put this chart up, because that'll take us right now. So that's during the debate. Then after the debate, 30 minutes after, here's how things change. And again, for those listening on podcast, just take us through this in some detail.
So the issues that lasted after the debate were the social issues, the discussions of abortion and LGBTQ rights, followed by environmental issues. Those were the things. Now, these are interesting because these are the things where we have seen before, there's a lot of disagreement among Canadians. Everybody can agree that affordability is an issue and that taxes are an issue. People disagree on some of these views on what to do about climate change and the rights of LGBTQ and of course, abortion issues. Now, Canadians are in favor of abortion. What the disagreement was about is if people elected a Conservative government, would this be reopened? As you remember, Mr. Scheer was not clear about this in the French debate. He was much clearer last night, but there was still this feeling that there's an agenda there.
Finally, before we get everybody else involved here, to what extent does your research indicate that the state of play was changed by last night's leaders' debate?
We saw a change among the regions, which we can talk about, particularly in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, but they netted each other out. It was interesting. Mr. Singh did best in Atlantic Canada in terms of seat count, but he pulled away from, in the swing ridings between the Conservatives and the Liberals, he pulled away from the Liberals, bringing the Conservatives up a little bit. But on the national scale, because Mr. Trudeau won some ground in Quebec last night, on a national scale, it made very little difference. Just a one-seat difference for the Liberals, a two-seat lift for the NDP, nothing for the Conservatives.
And in Ontario, any change?
Ontario was not, it wasn't the big, it was quite neutral last night.
Okay. Mark, let me get you in here. Right. There were moments when Andrew Scheer, and we saw some of them in the little clip pack off the top, where Andrew Scheer was absolutely blistering against Justin Trudeau, calling him some really intense stuff. How did the Liberal leader hold up in your view?
Well, I think he did very well last night. I'm just going to say at the outset, I think that was the worst format for a debate on planet Earth. Whoever decided that that was going to be the format, I think that they should be expelled, because this was a terrible format. It gave, and you're...
We're going to get to that.
You asked me the question, and I think based on that, I think Justin Trudeau, as the leader of the Liberal Party, did extraordinarily well, given that crazy format.
How much did Andrew Scheer do, Amanda, to introduce himself to Canadians who still are unsure about him?
I think what he's been doing, and we saw it with the first debate on City, and then again, is just speaking directly to camera. I thought actually off the top, him being very aggressive and getting that clip in early before people flipped off after 10 minutes of watching this, gong show to watch the hockey game was smart. I think, his ability to introduce people maybe isn't so much in a debate, although it's important because we get this kind of coverage in these flashpoints, but his day-to-day activity on the campaign, I think the digital stuff they're doing is really critical. And people are familiarizing themselves with who he is, and I think getting a bit more comfortable with him as opposed to where he wasn't as well known leading into the campaign.
What did you think of the attacks on Trudeau?
On his attacks on Trudeau?
Yeah.
I thought Trudeau benefited a ton from the format because he was sort of, at some point I was like, is the Prime Minister there? He's not talking at all. Like we're hearing from Elizabeth May and the Bloc and Maxime Bernier. I thought it was important for Scheer to go at him. I was surprised to see the Bloc ask the direct question to Scheer as opposed to Trudeau, frankly. But I think he did what he needed to do, which is motivate his base and his voters. And I think mix it up and bloody Trudeau a little bit. It was really important.
And let's get you in here. We heard that Pauly, the artificial intelligence pollster, thought that Jagmeet Singh did the best. Interestingly enough, last night, your former leader, Tom Mulcair, on national television said he thought Justin Trudeau did the best. What'd you make of that?
Well, I think that Tom Mulcair's comments were pretty roundly criticized, and there's a lot of disagreement with that. I think that not only do we have the results that Aaron presented here, but I think if you look across social media, you'll see lots and lots of support for for what Jagmeet Singh did last night. Listen, this was really his first introduction to Canadians. He's a relatively new leader. He's only been in the post for about 2 years. He hasn't run a federal campaign before, and I think that he presented himself very, very well. He was calm. He was assured. He had a good, strong policy focus. The goal for him going into that was to try and move away from all of the kind of noise around this campaign and in a very challenging format. I agree with the others about that. In a very challenging format, to try and stay focused on the issues and to make sure that that we were noticed and that people knew that this is not just a two-horse race. As he said, you don't have to choose between bad and worse.
Actually, he had a better line than that. What was it? You don't have to
delay and deny.
Delay and deny, yeah, yeah. Usually the NDP leader says Tweedledummer or something like that, but it was a new one last night. Let's get some analysis on the Greens. Elizabeth May, Abhijit, has been part of these debates for 13 years now, and, the public knows her well, and her performances over the years have kind of only garnered the Greens one seat over the course of her participation in these debates. Do we have any reason to suspect that last night changed any of that?
Yeah, because last night was the climate change debate. I mean, this entire election has been the climate change election, and the one reason for that is that the Greens have been at it for decades. And making sure that all the other parties now have a climate change plan is because of the advocacy and all the hard work that the Greens have been doing for all these years. Not to mention the fact that yesterday it was pretty evident of the fact that Elizabeth May was the most competent and the most experienced leader on stage, because she was the one talking about the most substance. Whenever people were giving one-liners and zingers, she was the one talking policy, and it showed. Not to mention the fact that she was also the only one who had a conciliatory tone, who was talking about working across party lines.
She wasn't very conciliatory when she looked at Andrew Scheer and said, "You're never going to be prime minister."
Well, I mean, she's just being honest there, and it's important to be honest with the country and make sure that people know that that you don't have to vote strategically liberal. You need to make sure that there are enough Greens to hold them to account and make sure that we keep them honest.
Okay, the biggest change in last night's debate, of course, was having Maxime Bernier there, the People's Party, brand new party, first time out the gate. In your view, Jared, how did his presence affect things?
Well, just being there obviously is the biggest impact that Max can have. Max is trying to leverage the idea that he's the only real conservative in the race, and you saw that being played out in the debate. His engagement was primarily with Mr. Scheer. It was trying to point out to Mr. Scheer that he's lost his way. You saw that Max was pointing out that he's the only one that comes at these problems and big issues from a different perspective. He basically is pointing to the rest on the stage, saying that they've arrived at a consensus on how to govern and that he doesn't agree with that consensus on some of the big issues. So what Max was doing was obviously bringing in that different viewpoint that a lot of people in the electorate believe is underserved. So I think he did that job. I mean, clearly he was a little nervous at the beginning, I think. We talked about the polling for Mr. Singh being boosted in that exchange where he accused Mr. Bernier of hate speech. I look at that from a different perspective. There's a lot of people who are concerned about censorious streaks within the current leftist political climate, and I think Mr. Bernier actually drew that out of Mr. Singh. And there's a lot of people, I think, that were very concerned when they heard Mr. Singh say that he was going to shut down Mr. Bernier's ideas.
Can I follow that up with Aaron? You would obviously know this as a pollster. There are people who will lie to pollsters because they think they want to give you the answer that they think is what you want to hear, as opposed to tell you what they really feel. And nowhere was that more evident than in the election of Donald Trump, where some people said they were not going to vote for Trump, but of course privately did. Is there a way for you to measure that, what he's talking about there? Maybe some people last night thought Bernier did better than they're prepared to admit to you?
Yes, absolutely. So the unique thing about the way Polly does it, first of all, she's looking at people who are usually speaking to their social network. So it's birds of a feather flock together. We usually see much more, like we saw that tendency in the American election and also in Brexit. We got that bang on as well, because we could see that people don't want to admit that they're going to vote for the unpopular person or idea. We are able to see what people like and what they read and what they approve of. So we are definitely cutting through that material. What we saw last night wasn't just people reacting to what Mr. Bernier had said, but also reacting to 2 points of what Mr. Singh had said. You remember there's a point in the debate where Mr. Singh said, yes, we have affordability issues, but let's not blame the 15-year-old refugee or the 12-year-old refugee child to say that it is the immigrant who's working 12-hour days. There's a lot of reaction there because we have seen, I've mentioned this before on the show, people blaming the influx of immigrants for the rise in house prices and things like that. So when Mr. Singh addressed that, it was poignant and people really reacted to it. A lot of the pushback that we are seeing on immigration issues is coming from Quebec with Bill 21, those types of things. That's more where it's concentrated. The rest of the country, we're not seeing it as much. But when Mr. Singh addressed that last night, a lot of people reacted to that very emotionally, and that's why he kind of won that side of it.
There's two ways to measure who wins a debate. One is the way we have been checking it so far. You check for engagement, you check and see what the polls say. Clearly, by all the polls and all of that the day after, it was Jagmeet Singh's night. The other way, and Mark, I'm going to make you wait to the end on this one.
Sure.
The other way to get to judge these things is, if you don't kill the king wins. Mm-hmm. Did anybody kill the king last night?
No, I actually don't think they did. And I I thought the format benefited the prime minister extremely, right? He didn't have to exchange a lot. When he did get into battles, it was within like a minute and a half, a minute 40 seconds. And he was smart in that he talked, whenever anyone was starting to get a line on him, he just started talking and all of a sudden the audio was unusable, which I thought was very smart. I think a lot of the leaders did what they needed to do. Like, I think Scheer went out and did what he needed to do. I think Jagmeet Singh obviously was the clear winner. I think everybody would agree with that generally. But I also think he's got like the Trudeau 2015 syndrome, which is, you know, when we all had such low expectations for the prime minister at the time. If he put his pants on, they said, and showed up at the debate, he'd be great, right? When he was coming into this campaign, no one thought I thought he wouldn't be leader by the end of this. And now we're seeing this poised, eloquent, like sort of relatable guy, which is unique on that stage of a lot of practiced politicians. So I think that's why he's punching through. But yeah, I think Scheer did what he needed to do, but I do not think anyone killed the king, which is why I think the prime minister benefits, and he's going into a French debate, which he is going to benefit in as well.
And did anybody knock the king off his pedestal last night?
Oh, I think that actually what's happening in this campaign is that we've always said that there's no such thing as a real knockout punch in a debate. But I think that the narrative is building that for progressive voters, many of whom would have been NDP voters last time and instead voted for the Liberals in the hopes that they would get a progressive government, many of those progressive voters are starting to get a level of, disillusionment, disappointment in the prime minister. So I don't think it's like a kill the king moment, but I think it is a gradual, feeling amongst progressive voters that he's not who he says he is, that he has not lived up to the expectations. So people who voted for him with great hope are quite disappointed. And I think the fact that Jagmeet did so well last night in the debate when there are more people watching will really contribute to that narrative.
There was a moment last night, Abhijit, where Elizabeth May looked at Justin Trudeau and said, "I sure hope you don't get a majority government because ... and she went on." Right. Did she kill the king with that line?
I think what actually was a better line was when she looked at him and with genuine feeling said that it was heartbreaking that when you promised something in 2015 and didn't follow through with it. I think that was something that caught my attention, and a lot of folks told me that that was something that reminded them that they had voted Liberal in 2015 and now they're going to be voting their conviction.
Jared.
I think nobody killed the king, but I think the king disappeared into a sea of progressive politics. The entire debate obviously being dominated and steered repeatedly to progressive debating topics. I think that what came out of it is that Mr. Trudeau disappeared into the sea of his competition, who I would say is everybody on that stage from the leftist or progressive viewpoint.
Can I say something on that? I think that was on purpose because Trudeau wanted to show the people that he was worried were going to bleed to the NDP that he was sensitive. That's why he kept bringing up the 50K tax cut, and we saw that worked. So I think that was on purpose. He wanted to win over the NDP because that's where he felt he was at risk of losing, and that was true last night because of Mr. Singh's performance. Had he not been able to wrestle that vote back and to show that he also could be progressive, that would have hurt him more. And I think that's why he only was down by one seat.
Okay, Mark, we have tested your patience. You have heard all the analysis here. Now you get to respond.
So look, I'm not going to get subjective on this. I think this has been a great campaign for the Liberal Party. I think that if you look at how Justin Trudeau is campaigning across this country, great crowds, everybody's smiling, they're happy. I think if you listen objectively to Canadians, I don't think there's this bloody-mindedness that this country is going to hell in a handbasket. I think that the debate last night, and I'll take what you said as meaning that Justin Trudeau, Jared, had an opportunity to say things, but that was unfortunate that the debate format never allowed that to happen. I think it was, as I'm going to go back, it was a brutal format, and whoever was responsible for that, I think it was great because it certainly gave people the opportunity to change the channel. And that certainly affected, I think, people's reaction to some of the things that you're talking about, Eric. Let me just talk about this. You have 5 leaders of 5 different parties against 1 leader of the governing party. And that is always going to be an opportunity for those guys to try to kill the king, and it never worked. He's got a record. He defended his record last night extraordinarily well, and I think that that weighs out when you said that even he didn't get a negative lift, he got a lift.
Yeah, and
So-
actually what he did very well was say, the people on the left want me to do more for the environment, want me to do more for cutting taxes, the people on the right want me to do less. And he showed himself to be the middle way, and that is what he had to do.
Right.
And I think he did that.
Well, thanks for agreeing with me, Aaron.
Well, all he had to do is hold his position. As like Elizabeth May said, he is in the lead. So you want to keep the lead.
Right, and it's interesting too because leaders of the other party, especially Elizabeth May, have to push the envelope, and they swung the pendulum way to whatever side to make the point. And I think Justin Trudeau brought it back to the center and made very good lines last night that in my opinion, held his ground.
He did a great one with Mr. Blanchet because he had lost a bit of ground in the French one, but with Mr. Blanchet when he said, Quebecers can be like Canadians, Mr. Blanchet, because they are Canadians and they will continue to be on my watch. And he stopped right there. And Blanchet, you could tell,
was a
knew
great
that.
line.
That was a good line.
That was a great
was
line.
good.
Yeah.
And it didn't feel scripted. It
Yes.
was in the moment because of something Blanchet had said.
Exactly.
It worked very well, and he got 3 seats up in Quebec over that.
Really?
Yes.
You could track that as a result of that
yes.
line.
Yes. Not just that line, but that was a very good point for him last night.
Amanda, can I ask you about the blackface, brownface stuff? Because that came up. Did it come up once last night and that was it? I mean, it barely came up if it came up at all. I can only.
Scheer raised it, and then oddly, the Prime Minister actually attacked Jagmeet Singh on racism, which I found very bizarre, I'll be honest.
Okay, would you have expected that to come up more in a debate where people are trying to get at the Prime Minister?
I would have expected it, frankly, to be a bigger deal than I think we've seen it to be, period, in this election campaign. When this happened, I mean, I was like gobsmacked, and I thought, oh, well, this is blowing it wide open. And then 3 days later, it's right back to the numbers didn't move, nothing shifted. So I think Andrew Scheer rightfully went after him about it directly.
But just once.
But just once, yeah. And I think partially because they look at the same polling that I'm sure you guys are seeing, and it's not getting a lot of traction with Canadians. So you want to talk about things that actually moves your vote. I did think that the Prime Minister's attack on Jagmeet Singh about not defending multiculturalism enough on Bill 21, when he kind of maybe might intervene, even though there's nothing stopping him from doing it right now other than his electoral prospects in Quebec, was way over the line and completely bizarre and very risky, given he was Mr. Blackface like a week and a half ago. So, I mean, I thought it's the whole debate around that issue is very strange, but I think part of it is Canadians are seeing so much like attack and this outrage culture, and they think back to stuff they put on social media, or like, I mean, I don't think any of us are wearing blackface so much we don't remember how many times we've done it, but we've done something stupid or said something stupid, so they're more forgiving than I think people expect them to be.
And I wonder if, I don't know how much, if any, influence you had in the formulation of Mr. Singh's approach last night, but I wonder if you suspect that there were conversations held about how hard or not Mr. Singh should go after Mr. Trudeau on this issue, given that, I think Paulie confirmed this, it's kind of been Jagmeet Singh's finest moment in public life, the way he has responded to this issue. What can you tell us about that?
Well, so he's had a few very, very good moments during this campaign. So he went into this debate having built up a lot of credibility, I think, amongst the few people that were watching. I think more people watched last night. And I do think that his goal was to try, we have a sense that people are at least complaining about the fact that there's so little discussion about policy, that so much of it is about throwing attacks at each other and that kind of thing. So I think that his goal going into the debate last night was to try and pull it back to some of the really important policy issues that he's been campaigning on. And I think that there has been a lot of policy in this campaign, but it isn't being talked about. So I think that's what he wanted to do in that. And I also don't know if it's really, his very presence there, I think, makes a statement about his views on these issues. And if I could just say something about the numbers as well, I'm happy to see all these numbers, and I know that not much has shifted in terms of vote intention for a lot of people, but we're coming up to one of the most important moments in this campaign, I think, and that is following this big debate tonight, then the French language debate on Thursday. We then have Thanksgiving dinner and Thanksgiving weekend, and I think if we are going to see any kind of movement in the numbers, it's going to be over the long weekend.
Okay, as people get a chance to sit down and and talk with friends and family about it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and it usually like after a debate that does have kind of defining moments, it takes about 48 hours or so to start to percolate and make a difference. I remember in the 2011 debate, people didn't think that Jack Layton had done particularly well, and voters disagreed.
Indeed, they did. Mark, I want to ask you, I want you to follow up on Amanda's comment.
Yep.
Did you find it a little precious of the Prime Minister to look at Jagmeet Singh and say, you haven't really come down hard enough on Bill 21, whereas I'm the only leader here who has said that I may, at some point in the future, keep open the option of doing something formally about this? It seemed a bit odd.
I'm not going to pull out, the rationale for why he would make that comment, but I will say that I think there's absolute. I'm going to say from the NDP's campaign, I think there's a little bit of tension in terms of that issue in the province of Quebec as it relates to the NDP. So I think he called it out. And I think that was the issue. I think that it was a very interesting, more so than that, was that the Bloc leader was actually calling out the Conservative Party for a lot of these kinds of issues as it related to Bill 21. So I'm not necessarily in agreement that the Prime Minister made a mistake doing that, because I think he knows that he could probably fill in the gap that was left by what Jagmeet Singh had said at the outset on that.
Okay. I want, Aaron, you to come in at this point, and I want to very delicately deal with an issue that exploded on social media over the weekend, but not one word of it has appeared in legacy media. You didn't read anything about it in the papers. You haven't seen it on the local news or the national news for that matter. And that is, there was a lot of gossip being traded in over the weekend on social media about why Justin Trudeau left his job as a teacher in British Columbia midway through the school year. And we are not going to repeat on this program any of the allegations that were made because nothing's been proven. Suffice it to say, there was a ton of engagement about it on social media over the weekend. And what I'm trying to understand is whether or not, even though it didn't show up in legacy media, that has an impact that you can discern on people's voting intentions.
This was really interesting for us because we discussed it in our meeting this week, and we said this might be our first ability to test the concept of manufactured news or fake news in an election, because we don't know the veracity of it. However, because it has been unsubstantiated, it's a way for us to look at how it moves through the social network. So it was really interesting, and it moved the way we thought it would.
Which means what?
So we created different samples of people we know are far-right conservatives, far-right left, very centrist. And all of these had been exposed to this story. In certain circles, the story traveled much more quickly than in the centrist circles. So, and that is what we would have expected for a story that is unsubstantiated and is not in the mainstream. You would expect that it stays within its network. So to the extent that it bleeds out of its main network, then you say this is something that's going to affect the election. And you worry about that because it's unsubstantiated and yet it's traveling through normal networks. This one has stayed within its own network. So the people who are not going to vote for Justin Trudeau and are quite on the far right, were circulating this much more quickly and were much more believing of it. People in the centrists were much more skeptical. This is unsubstantiated. It sounds like fake news. Is it just something people are trying to put in there to sway votes without having the magnifying glass on it?
So bottom line, not impactful on the outcome.
It has not impacted so far.
Okay, good to know. All right, I want to make Mark's dreams come true now and have a discussion about the format of last night's debate.
Beautiful.
We know he has weighed in and didn't think much of it. Okay, let's get to this. Jared, what do you think?
The format of the debate? I mean, when you have that many people on a stage, I'm not sure you can do much better. Once you invite everyone to the rodeo, you're going to get some interesting approaches. Nobody's going to be able to get any sort of core messaging out in any great way, but like I said, I think they did as good as they could. I thought the moderators did a fine job, and they did allow a little bit of one-on-one sparring. There was some over-talking in the beginning that a lot of people did acknowledge, but if you look at it from the perspective of, Max Bernier, he got some airtime that he wouldn't have otherwise received, and I think he did manage to hit some of the notes that he needed to hit. But absolutely, it's probably the best you can do in the circumstances.
Again, for those who might have missed it last night, here is some of what we're talking about. Sheldon, if you would.
That means we're going to have to cut our emissions by more than half.
But you need to have a
It
plan
absolutely
that
means
is rooted
it
in a
absolutely
target
means we've got to
that
take it on.
saves our kids' future.
It means we're going to have to reduce our emissions by more than half.
I just want to add, I think
We've got to take on
it's
the
important right
powerful
now.
at the
People
top.
must
We're
know
prepared
that.
to do that.
People must know that Mr. Scheer.
Okay, sometimes it was pretty tough to understand what was going on. And what did you think of the debate from that standpoint?
So I think it was not as bad as I feared. I mean, I went into it expecting a complete and total gong show, and I was quite worried about the format. So it was not really as bad as I feared. There were some moments where you got some good points out. There were some genuine moments between different leaders. But I do think that we need to re-examine the whole debates commission because it hasn't worked. The idea was that it was going to be more regulated with just and they were going to have the English debate and the French debate, and the TBA debate got added in. I mean, it's just been a mess, really, the whole debate commission thing. And I do believe that putting Maxime Bernier in the debate was a mistake. It was that he did not meet the criteria, and that was just maybe a political decision on the part of the debates commission, not wanting to take the flak or whatever. But he did not belong there, and it was not just because of his views, which I think are anathema to many of us, but because he did not meet the criteria as a federal leader.
Abhijit, the debate, the format in terms of helping people understand issues better, giving the leaders a chance to shine, giving the voters a sense of maybe who to vote for after it was all said and done. What'd you think?
I thought the format itself was perfectly fine. I think the participants were the ones to blame for talking over each other. It's just, I mean, there were moments where there was actual conversation happening, but half the time it was a lot of strategy going on to make sure you drown out the other person so they don't get their point across. I think the moderators did a fantastic job, especially Rosemary Barton and Althea Raj were outshone everyone. And I think there was, as you can see from that earlier clip, you can see the look on Elizabeth's face of just utter dismay of, the impoliteness of everyone talking over each other. Just make sure that everyone can get a fair chance. And I think the format isn't to blame. I think it's the participants.
Amanda, your view.
I thought the format was atrocious. I don't think that Maxime Bernier had a place on the stage, and I agree with Anne. It's not about his views, which I'll park my disagreements with those, but it's just he didn't meet the litmus test of why. Like, it's a brand new party. They haven't elected anyone. Like, I do not understand why he was there.
We know the explanation that the debate commission gave, that he's got a
polling.
He's got a chance. Polling suggests he has a chance of being competitive in a few ridings.
Yeah, which is also why you don't have a debate commission dictate this kind of stuff, right? Like, I think it should be, and with all due respect to former Governor General Johnson, who's a wonderful man, I just think this was a bit of a political beast and got manipulated by lots of people. I also thought having so many moderators was a disservice. I mean, it was great to see lots of women up there, but you moderate debates, like you get into it, and then all of a sudden you're just yanked off. There's a brand new person. There's new pacing. That's a very challenging format unto itself. I also thought the idea of only drawing random issues, like healthcare wasn't on the table at all. That's a pretty big issue for Canadians and a pretty big budget number for all of them.
Pharmacare came up a lot.
Sure, it did, but because they forced it in, because Jagmeet Singh and Elizabeth May actually forced it to be a discussion.
Yep.
So I hope that whoever is in charge rips up this debate commission, burns all the papers it organizes so they cannot rise again from the ashes of whatever it is, and we go back to something else.
Get off the fence and tell me what you really think.
I know.
Yeah. Your view on it?
Well, people were engaged. So you saw, whether or not Maxime Bernier belonged there, he certainly got a lot of engagement from people. It was the first time that they had seen him.
Did you pick up on stuff on social media last night about what people thought of the format?
We didn't look for that specifically.
Oh, okay.
So no, I don't. We can certainly go back and we can talk about it on Friday. But no, we didn't look for that specifically. But people certainly were engaged and they were talking about it. And you saw that Maxime Bernier got quite a bit of engagement. I don't think it helped him, but it was probably the first exposure that people have had to him. So, but I didn't see It didn't bother me.
Bernier supporters would say you can't have much of a debate without a different viewpoint on the stage, and frankly, he's the only one that brings it. So I think he added a little spice to the debate. He talked about hot-button issues from a perspective that isn't being discussed in other quarters and other parties. So I think you only have a debate with someone like him on the stage.
He got more buzz than Trudeau and Scheer, so
that is fact.
But that's a disservice. But frankly, he shouldn't have, right? Like he doesn't get the litmus test. And by the way, I actually thought, having watched him as a cabinet minister, he underperformed like crazy in the debate last night. He was not as coherent as he normally is. He was not as effective, and he spoke over top of people so much. Like, yeah, sure, people buzzed about him, but is that the right decision? Is that the responsible thing to be doing?
I think he settled in at the end of the debate. I think certainly at the beginning there were some nerves, and when he was told it was open debate, I think he took that literally and jumped in when he saw an opportunity to do so. But he settled in.
I want to get Mark on the issue of timing. Because they had a certain number of issues they wanted to cover, because they had so many leaders on the stage, there were moments when you had massive issues like climate change. Tell me everything you believe about climate change and do it in 40 seconds. How useful was that to the voters?
It was not useful at all. And I think you made a point about three items: information for those who are interested, the candidates and getting their messages out, and for the voters if the candidates could be appealing to them. On each of those, I would say no, no, no. Nothing happened. Let me give you this as a stark example. There was a question last night from a young Indigenous woman who asked Andrew Scheer, your leader, a question. And then Rosemary Barton says, you have 40 seconds. And he said, this is the most complicated issue, and you're asking me to answer it in 40 seconds. Yeah. It was ridiculous. The whole premise was ridiculous. I think what we should do, all of us here, is say, let's write a letter to the commission, say, put Steve Paikin back on to moderate those debates. But my point is this. I think that and somebody raised the specter in this debate, you heard this discussion around the table tonight. The culture changed every time the moderator changed. Yeah. That was wrong, and it got everybody off their game on that dais. And I think what we should have done is have one moderator and had it done so that I could see a debate between Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau that wasn't crazy like it was last night by your leader. I'm sorry, but and I think it would have been great for people to see for your leader to out himself for the kind of commentary that he has. Those are the kinds of things that I think would have been good around that debate. Never happened.
Yeah, to have a moderator let it go when it needed to go, which we've seen in past debates.
It seemed they had very little flexibility to play with the times in that respect.
Right. Yeah. And that's what makes a good debate. I found last night it was boring. It was a bit of a sleeper, and you saw people trailed off.
Interestingly, I thought the post-debate scrum was a better way in which the parties could get their message out.
Totally.
And if you watched any of that, you would have been satisfied with your leader, I'm guessing, and the fact that they had some time to actually be themselves and answer questions in an unscripted way. So I actually enjoyed the post-debate scrum.
It's interesting that many of you have questioned whether or not Maxime Bernier belonged there last night, and that's one thing you can debate. I haven't heard anybody raise the issue of whether or not the Bloc Québécois leader ought to have been there last night, given that he's only running candidates in one province. And I can't imagine there are too many Anglophones in Quebec that are going to vote for the Bloc. Did anybody think he didn't belong there last night?
I've said it, and I do think I don't think we should have a separatist leader that only runs, you should have to run candidates across Canada to be in national debates. If you're a separatist party, it makes no sense. I thought he also, by the way, I think he's a good debater. He was, and the Bloc plays a spoiler role, right?
Yes.
In English debates, doesn't matter. He just throws a stink bomb out there and we'll react to it,
Absolutely.
right? No, it's what he did last night.
Yes,
I think he actually changed the trajectory of that debate, and he has not done the bare minimum to actually be in it. So we should have a real conversation around that. I think there should be the four leaders, and that's it.
Well, in fact, Elizabeth May was kept out of the TVA debate because she didn't have any seats in Quebec.
Right.
That's right.
So,
yeah, I definitely think you should
as
be
Mitt
running
Romney would
seats.
say, what's sauce for the goose? But anyway, I got 2 minutes left, and I want to ask one last question. Mark Healy, take it away. How well did this debate do? How well did it serve Canadians in helping them decide who to vote for?
My best example to answer your question is this. I watched the debate last night with my two sons. My sons are 17 and 15. And you know what they said? Daddy, this is crazy. I'm more cynical now than I've ever been. So it didn't do it. And my kids are political observers like the old man is. My point is this. I think that Canadians were not served well, A, by the format, and secondly, that nobody got a message out that was halfway informative to voters in this country.
Let me save some time for Anne. Anne, your view on how well this served Canadians to help them decide?
Oh, I think it's very important, and I'm very glad that it happened. And I think, from the perspective of the NDP and Jagmeet Singh, it was an opportunity to be introduced to Canadians, for Canadians to get to know him a bit more, and to see that he has some very substantive policy offers and that he's talking about the issues that matter most to Canadians. I think it was very good in that way. And and as I said before, I think that as the days go on and as we move into Thanksgiving weekend, people will use that debate as part of their decision making.
Amanda, you got the last word. How well did this help people decide?
I don't think it changed anyone's mind, truly. I think the noise was to the detriment of undecided voters and leaders. I think if you tuned in last night, you flipped to the hockey game pretty fast. So I think that was bad. I think more debates.
And that was sad, too.
Yeah, it was. But I didn't watch that one, unfortunately, because I know it was Kevin Hart.
Leafs lost to the Stanley Cup champs.
Oh, well, there we go. But I do think that at least we're having the debate. And I think that's, to Anne's point, that's important. I do think it really will affect things. And I'm really interested to see what happens after Thanksgiving weekend.
Gotcha. Mr. Director, can you put up a 6-shot? Is that possible? Can we do that? Wow, there it is. Ask and it happens. We're grateful to everybody for coming in this night after the biggest event in the campaign so far in terms of all 6 being in one place at one time. 2 weeks to go, less than 2 weeks to go, and we shall keep watching. Thanks, everybody, for coming into TVO tonight, and good to see you in the nation's capital.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.